My husband never knew that I earned $70,000 a month. He thought I had been living off his money for 40 years. When he filed for divorce at my 73, "You're a broke housewife," he laughed. Until my lawyer stood up and handed the judge one paper. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Eleanor Whitfield, and I am 73 years old. I have lived in the same white colonial house on Sycamore Drive in Asheville, North Carolina, for 41 years. I raised 3 children in that house, planted roses along the south fence, and learned, over 4 decades, exactly which floorboard creaks at 2 in the morning and which window lets in the smell of honeysuckle every June. I knew that house the way I knew my own hands. Every crack, every corner, every quiet. What I did not know for most of those 41 years was how to stop being invisible. My husband's name is Ronald Whitfield, Ron. He is 76 years old, broad-shouldered even now, with the kind of silver hair that made younger women at church functions glance at him twice. He was a civil engineer for 35 years, respectable, steady, the kind of man who kept his tools organized in the garage and his opinions organized about everything else, including me. Ron believed, genuinely, completely, without a flicker of doubt, that I was financially dependent on him, that every blouse I wore, every book I bought, every quiet lunch I had with my friend Carol on the 3rd Thursday of the month was paid for by his pension and his careful budgeting. He believed this because I let him believe it. Not out of deception, not at first. Out of habit. Out of the slow, quiet arithmetic of a marriage where one person's confidence expands to fill every room, and the other person simply steps aside and finds other rooms entirely. I need to tell you how it started. In 1987, when our youngest, Daniel, was 4 years old, I began writing. Nothing dramatic. I was an English literature graduate from UNC Chapel Hill, and writing had always been mine the way the kitchen was supposedly mine. Privately, thoroughly, without ceremony. I started with a small column for a regional women's magazine called Southern Home and Heart. $12 per piece. Ron thought it was a hobby, a little creative outlet for the restless housewife, and I did not correct him. By 1993, I had a monthly column. By 1999, I had a book deal, a quiet memoir about raising children in the New South, published under my maiden name, Margaret Eleanor Hale. It sold modestly. Enough. But then the internet arrived, and something unexpected happened. My voice, which Ron had always spoken over at dinner parties, turned out to be something other people wanted to hear. By 2010, I had a website. By 2015, I had a newsletter with 200,000 subscribers. By 2019, I had brand partnerships, a second book, an online writing course that sold out 4 times a year, and a quiet, separate bank account at a credit union in Weaverville that Ron had never once asked about. My accountant, a careful, discreet woman named Patricia Owens, helped me structure everything properly. Taxes paid, LLCs filed, every dollar documented, $70,000 a month on average for the last 4 years. Ron played golf on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He watched the evening news. He complained about the price of gasoline. He told guests at our anniversary dinner in 2021 that Margaret kept herself busy with her little writing projects, and he smiled the way a man smiles when he believes he is being generous. I smiled too, and I said nothing. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs that should have alarmed me far earlier than they did. Small things. A coldness that crept in around 2020, after the children were fully gone, after the house grew quiet. Ron began making comments about money with an edge I hadn't heard before. He reorganized our joint household account without telling me. reducing my monthly transfer by $400. When I asked about it, he said he was streamlining. When I asked what that meant, he told me not to worry about things I didn't understand. I began to notice his phone, not obsessively. I am not that kind of woman. But a wife of 40 years notices when her husband starts angling his screen away at the dinner table, notices when he volunteers, unprompted, that he had lunch alone on a Wednesday, notices the new cologne. Her name, I would later learn, was Diane Fulton, 58 years old, a recently divorced woman from Ron's tennis club with highlighted hair and the specific enthusiasm of someone auditioning for a second act. I do not say this with cruelty. I say it because it matters. Because it explains why, on a Tuesday evening in March of last year, Ron set down his fork at our kitchen table, folded his napkin with the deliberate calm of a man who has rehearsed, and told me he wanted a divorce. "You've had a good life, Margaret," he said. "But let's be honest with each other. You're dependent on me. You've always been dependent on me. The court will see that." He actually smiled. Just slightly. "You're a 73-year-old housewife with no income and no prospects. I'll make sure you're taken care of, but don't make this ugly." I looked at him across 40 years of dinners and silences and small surrenders, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not grief, not rage. Something quieter and more durable than either. I thought about the document my attorney had prepared 6 months earlier, just in case, sitting in a manila folder in Patricia's office. I picked up my fork and finished my dinner. I did not sleep that night. I want to be honest about that because I think there is a temptation, when telling a story like this, to make the protagonist sound braver than she was in the dark. I lay in the guest room. I had moved there 3 months earlier, quietly, without discussion, the way I did most things. And I stared at the ceiling, and I took inventory. What did I actually stand to lose? The house on Sycamore Drive was purchased in 1983 in both our names. It had been appraised the previous autumn at $640,000. The furniture, the rose garden, the particular quality of afternoon light in the kitchen, none of that was legally mine alone. Our joint checking account held approximately $34,000. Ron's pension from the State Engineering Bureau was $4,200 per month. He had a 401k worth roughly $380,000, which he managed himself and spoke of rarely. And then there was what he did not know about. My LLC, Hale Creative, LLC, registered in my maiden name in 2013, held assets he had never seen. My credit union account, my investment portfolio, managed conservatively through a firm in Asheville that Patricia had recommended. Royalties, course revenue, sponsorship contracts with 4 wellness and lifestyle brands that renewed annually. None of it was hidden in any illegal sense. It was simply separate. He had never asked, and I had never offered, and the law, I would discover, had complicated feelings about that arrangement. The fear came around 3 a.m. Real fear. The specific kind that arrives when you have stopped distracting yourself. What if the court viewed my separate finances as marital property anyway? What if Ron hired an aggressive attorney who subpoenaed everything? What if my children, Daniel, Susan, and James, felt betrayed when they learned what I had kept from their father? What if I, at 73, with my knees that ached in November and my reading glasses perpetually misplaced, was simply too tired to fight? I thought about Diane Fulton's highlighted hair. Then I thought about Ron's smile across the dinner table. You're a 73-year-old housewife with no income and no prospects. The fear did not disappear, but it moved. It shifted from the center of my chest to the outer edge, and in the space it left behind, something else grew. I have always been a writer, and writers are, at their core, people who take the shapeless and give it structure. I reached for the notepad on the nightstand, and I began to write. Not a story, a plan. By 4:30 in the morning, I had 6 pages in my small, careful handwriting. The plan was not dramatic. It did not involve revenge in any cinematic sense. It involved precision. It involved the quiet accumulation of the right information in the right order, delivered to the right people at the right time. It involved calling Patricia Owens first thing in the morning. It involved calling an attorney. Not the one Ron would expect me to use, not the mild estate lawyer who had drawn up our wills, but a family law specialist with a reputation in Buncombe County for being, as Carol had once described her, the woman you don't want across the table from you. Her name was Beverly Marsh. She had a small office on Lexington Avenue with a Norfolk pine in the window and a manner that suggested she had seen everything and was no longer surprised by any of it. I had kept her card in the back of my address book for 2 years. I had hoped I would never need it. I took it out that morning and held it in both hands for a long moment, standing in my kitchen in the gray early light, listening to Ron's alarm go off upstairs. He came down at 7, dressed for the golf course. He poured his coffee without looking at me. He had the particular ease of a man who believes the hard part is over, who has delivered his verdict and is simply waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. "I'll have Gerald contact you next week," he said, meaning his attorney, Gerald Fitch, who had handled Ron's business matters for 30 years. "There's no need to make this complicated." "Of course," I said. He left at 7:15. I listened to his car back out of the driveway. Then I called Patricia. Then I called Beverly Marsh. Beverly's assistant put me through within 20 minutes. "Mrs. Whitfield," Beverly said. Her voice was low and unhurried. "Tell me everything, and don't leave anything out because you think it will make you look bad. That's my job. Your job is to be completely honest with me." So I was. For 2 hours, sitting at the kitchen table where Ron had delivered his verdict the evening before, I told Beverly Marsh about 40 years of marriage, about Hale Creative LLC, about $70,000 a month, about a woman named Diane, and about a husband who had never once asked where I went on Wednesday afternoons. When I finished, there was a brief silence. "Margaret," Beverly said, "I need you to listen carefully. You are not in the position your husband believes you are in, but we need to move carefully and thoroughly. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning at 9? I said yes. I watered my roses after I hung up. They were just beginning to bud. It seemed important somehow to water them. Beverly's office was smaller than I expected for someone with her reputation, but I had learned over 73 years that the most formidable people rarely needed large rooms. She sat across from me at a desk stacked with orderly files, her reading glasses pushed up on her head, and she laid out the landscape with the directness of a woman who charged by the hour and respected her clients enough not to waste their time. North Carolina is an equitable distribution state. That meant the court would divide marital assets fairly, though not necessarily equally, based on a range of factors: the length of the marriage, each spouse's economic circumstances, contributions to the household. The key question, Beverly explained, was the distinction between marital property and separate property. Assets acquired before the marriage or kept genuinely separate throughout could potentially be classified as separate. My LLC, established in my maiden name, with its own accounts, its own tax filings, and, critically, no commingling with our joint finances, had a reasonable argument for separate property classification. "Reasonable," I said, "not certain." "Nothing in family law is certain," Beverly said. "But your documentation is exceptional. Your accountant is exceptional. And juries and judges are human beings. A 73-year-old woman who built a legitimate business over 3 decades, quietly, without fanfare, while maintaining a household and raising 3 children, is a sympathetic figure. She let that sit for a moment. Your husband's attorney will argue that your business benefited from the stability of the marital home, that you used marital resources, his income, to free yourself from financial pressure while you built Hale Creative. That argument has some merit, and we need to be prepared for it. I had thought about that at 3 a.m, lying in the guest room. What do? We document everything, Beverly said. Every expense your business incurred, every resource you used. We demonstrate that Hale Creative was built on your labor, your expertise, and your audience, none of which Ron Whitfield contributed to in any measurable way. She was right. He hadn't. He had, in fact, actively discouraged it. I remembered him telling guests as recently as 2022 that Margaret played at writing. I had his words on a video recording from Susan's birthday party, captured accidentally on someone's phone. I mentioned this to Beverly. She wrote it down without changing her expression, but I saw her eyes sharpen. "Send me that video," she said. I left Beverly's office at 11:15 and drove directly to Patricia's firm in Weaverville. Patricia had already begun pulling together the full financial documentation. 4 years of LLC tax returns, bank statements from the credit union, investment account records, brand partnership contracts, 6 banker's boxes, ultimately. The paper weight of a secret life, made orderly and irrefutable. It was on the drive home that my phone rang. "Ron, Gerald tells me you've retained Beverly Marsh," he said. His voice had a new quality, not quite anger yet, but a tightening. The voice of a man who has received unexpected information and is recalibrating. "That's correct," I said. "Margaret." A pause. The sound of a man choosing his words with more care than he was accustomed to needing. "Beverly Marsh is a very aggressive attorney. That's going to make this more expensive for both of us." "I imagine it might," I said. "I told you, and I intend to take care of you. There's no need for—" "Ron," I said, and something in my voice made him stop. I hadn't planned it, hadn't rehearsed it. It simply arrived. "I'll see you in court." I hung up. My hands were steady on the steering wheel. I noticed that, with something like surprise. The Blue Ridge Mountains were doing what they always do in April, turning that improbable, luminous green that never quite looks real. And I drove through them feeling, for the first time in a long time, entirely like myself. Ron was not idle, of course. In the 2 weeks that followed, I became aware, through Beverly's contacts, through courthouse records, through the specific silence of a small city where people talk, that Gerald Fitch had filed a motion to compel full financial disclosure. Standard procedure, expected. But Ron had also, Beverly informed me, hired a private investigator. His name was Todd Briggs. 42 years old, former law enforcement, based in Arden. "He'll be looking for assets," Beverly said. "Hidden accounts, undisclosed income. Let him look. Everything is documented and properly filed." "Should I be concerned?" I asked. Beverly looked at me steadily. "He's going to find your business, Margaret. That's the point. When he does, Ronald's team will believe they've uncovered something damaging. What they won't immediately understand is that it isn't." She was right. 3 days later, Gerald Fitch filed a supplemental motion citing newly discovered financial interests of the defendant and requesting an emergency hearing. Beverly received the filing on a Thursday morning and called me immediately. "He thinks he has you," she said. There was something in her voice I hadn't heard before, a quiet satisfaction, like a chess player watching an opponent take a piece that was always meant to be taken. He's about to walk into the strongest part of our case. I was in my garden when she called. The roses along the south fence were fully open now. I looked at them for a moment after I hung up, their particular stubborn beauty. And I thought about the 40 years I had spent in that house, building something Ron never bothered to see. The point of no return, Beverly later told me, is always when the other side thinks they've won. The emergency hearing was held on a Wednesday morning in courtroom 4B of the Buncombe County Courthouse, a room with fluorescent lighting and wood paneling that had seen better decades. Beverly and I arrived at 8:45. Ron and Gerald Fitch were already there, seated at the respondent's table, and Ron looked up when I walked in with a particular expression I recognized from 40 years of marriage. The expectant confidence of a man who has already decided how a situation will resolve. Gerald Fitch was exactly what I had expected. A heavyset man in his 60s who had made a career of knowing exactly which corners of the law to lean against. He and Beverly exchanged the careful, practiced cordiality of two professionals who had opposed each other before. I sat down and folded my hands on the table and waited. Gerald argued that my separate financial interests, Hale Creative LLC, the credit union accounts, the investment portfolio, represented marital assets that had been deliberately concealed. He used the word concealed 4 times. He suggested that the scale of the income, and here he named the figure, $70,000 per month, and I watched Ron's attorney let the number hang in the air like a verdict, demonstrated a pattern of financial deception within the marriage. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Dawson, a composed woman in her 50s who gave the impression of having heard every variety of human foolishness, made a note. Beverly rose. She did not raise her voice. She rarely did, I would learn. She simply presented the full tax history of Hale Creative LLC, filed annually and correctly since 2013. The separate account established in 2010 before the LLC was formalized at a credit union where Ron Whitfield had never held an account and had never been listed as a beneficiary. Patricia Owens's sworn affidavit attesting to the complete financial independence of the business from marital funds and, efficiently, without drama. A curated timeline demonstrating that every dollar earned by Hale Creative was earned through Margaret Eleanor Hale's independent intellectual labor. There was no concealment, Beverly said. There was separation. My client built a business. She paid her taxes. She asked for nothing from the marital estate and took nothing. If Mr. Whitfield was unaware of his wife's professional accomplishments, that speaks to the quality of his attention, not to any wrongdoing on her part. Judge Dawson denied Gerald's motion. I did not look at Ron when we stood to leave, but I heard him. A sharp exhale, the sound of a man recalibrating faster than he was comfortable doing. In the corridor outside courtroom 4B, Gerald Fitch took Beverly aside for a private word. I stood near the window overlooking the parking lot below and straightened my jacket. That was when Diane Fulton appeared. I hadn't expected her. She was waiting in the corridor. I would learn later that she had driven herself, uninvited by anyone's legal team, operating on the conviction that her presence might somehow help. She was attractive in a carefully maintained way, wearing a coat that was slightly too young for her, and she looked at me with an expression that combined pity and triumph in a ratio that told me she had rehearsed this encounter in her bathroom mirror. "Margaret," she said. She used my name as though we were acquainted. "I just want you to know that Ron and we genuinely care about your well-being. We don't want you to struggle. Whatever you need." "Diane," I said pleasantly, "you're speaking to me in a courthouse corridor while my attorney is 15 feet away. I'd strongly advise you to stop." She stopped. What came next was less pleasant. That evening, Ron left 3 voicemails. The first was conciliatory. He had reconsidered. He wanted to talk. Perhaps they could resolve this quietly. The second, left 40 minutes later, had shed the conciliation. He knew I had been hiding money from him. He would make sure the court understood the full picture. I should not imagine that Beverly Marsh was as clever as she thought she was. The third was left just after 10 o'clock at night, and his voice in it was different, lower, with an edge of something I had not heard from him in decades. He said that if I insisted on embarrassing him, I would regret it. I saved all three to a cloud recording service and emailed the files to Beverly before I went to bed. Beverly's response arrived at 7 the next morning. Perfect. Do not respond to him. Do not respond to Diane. If he contacts you again, forward everything to me immediately. The following week was tense in the specific way of waiting. The particular silence of a conflict suspended, both sides regrouping. Gerald Fitch filed 2 additional motions. Beverly answered both. Ron drove past the house on Sycamore Drive twice on a Saturday afternoon. I watched from the kitchen window and did not go to the door. And then I gave myself 3 days. I drove to Highlands, North Carolina, a small town in the mountains where I had once taken the children decades ago and where I knew a quiet inn with a porch that faced west. I sat on that porch with a cup of coffee every morning and watched the ridgelines change color. I brought no laptop. I told Beverly where I was and asked her to contact me only if something urgent arose. Nothing urgent arose. On the second evening, I called my daughter Susan. She was 44, a school administrator in Charlotte, steady and perceptive. I told her, carefully and completely, everything. She listened without interrupting. She had always been the best listener of my 3 children. And when I finished, there was a pause. "Mom," she said, "how long have you been carrying this by yourself?" "A while," I said. "You should have told me sooner." "I know," I said. "I'm telling you now." She was silent for a moment. "Do you need me to come?" "Not yet," I said. "But soon, maybe." I returned to Asheville on a Thursday morning, rested in the specific way of someone who has made a decision they intend to keep. The roses on Sycamore Drive had grown another inch. I carried my bag inside and sat at my desk and opened my laptop. I had work to do. It was Gerald Fitch who made the first approach, and he did it through channels that were legal, but carried the unmistakable atmosphere of an offer you were meant to feel fortunate to receive. Beverly called me on a Monday morning, 10 days after I returned from Highlands. "Ronald's team has proposed a settlement," she said. "I want to read you the terms before I say anything, so you have a clean first impression." The terms were, Ron would retain the house on Sycamore Drive. I would receive a cash settlement of $180,000 and spousal support of $1,800 per month for 7 years. My separate business assets, Hale Creative LLC, would be acknowledged as non-marital, but subject to a one-time contribution adjustment of $250,000, representing, Gerald's filing argued, the indirect benefit I had derived from marital stability while building the company. There was a silence after Beverly finished reading. "He wants me to pay him," I said, "for the privilege of having been married to him." "That is essentially the argument," Beverly said. I heard something careful in her voice. The discipline of an attorney who has opinions she is choosing to deliver at the right moment. "My professional assessment?" "Please." "Rejected entirely. This settlement is structured for someone who needs the money, someone who is afraid, and someone who doesn't understand that the contribution adjustment argument has very limited legal standing given your documentation. He is testing you, Margaret. He wants to see how frightened you are." I thought about the 3 voicemails. The car driving slowly past the house. Diane in the corridor with her rehearsed pity. "Draft the rejection," I said, politely but without any ambiguity. "Already started," Beverly said. Gerald received our rejection that afternoon. By Tuesday evening, I received a message from Ron's sister, Patricia Whitfield, a woman I had exchanged Christmas cards with for 40 years and eaten Thanksgiving turkey beside for nearly as long. The message was warm in its surface layer and cold in its architecture. She was worried about me, she wrote. Ron was heartbroken. Surely I understood that he had provided well for our family all those years. Surely I didn't want to spend my 70s in courtrooms. She hoped I would consider what was really in my best interest. I read the message twice. Then I saved it to the folder I had labeled, without particular sentiment, Evidence of Pressure Campaign. I did not reply. What struck me most in those weeks was how much of my own stillness surprised me. I had expected, when all of this began, to feel the kind of relentless anxiety that had accompanied the hard stretches of my life before. The years when the children were small and money was genuinely uncertain, the year my mother died, the slow erosion of a marriage I had tried for a very long time to believe was still workable. But the anxiety did not come in the way I had anticipated. There was stress. Of course there was. I am a human woman, not a monument. But beneath it was something I could only describe as bedrock. The knowledge that I had done nothing wrong. That everything I had built was real and documented and mine. That I was not, in fact, the woman Ron had described across the dinner table. I wrote about it, carefully and without identifying details, in my newsletter that month. The piece was called The Inventory. It was about taking stock of what you actually have, as opposed to what you have been told you have. It was the most opened newsletter I had published in 3 years. 11,000 replies. I read them all. The social support that Beverly had quietly suggested I cultivate. Not for legal purposes, but for your own endurance, she had said. Arrived in forms I hadn't expected. Carol, my oldest friend, drove over from Black Mountain every Thursday evening with food she claimed was left over from her own cooking, which was transparently untrue and entirely generous. My neighbor Evelyn, a retired nurse in her late 60s, began appearing on my porch with no particular agenda, which is the most comforting kind of presence. And Susan, my daughter, my good listener, called every Sunday without fail and asked the right questions and did not offer the wrong reassurances. My sons were harder. James, the eldest, was torn in the specific way of sons who have spent their lives watching their fathers perform competence. He called Ron regularly, I knew, and he struggled to integrate the version of his mother he was now encountering with the version he had always comfortably assumed. Daniel, the youngest, was more direct. He called me in early May, his voice rough, and said, "Mom, I didn't know you had all of that going on. I should have paid more attention." It was the most honest thing he had said to me in years, and I loved him for it. Ron, meanwhile, was watching. Beverly had sources. The legal community in Asheville is not large, and she told me that Gerald Fitch had requested 2 extensions on filing deadlines, which suggested that their strategy was being reconsidered. Ron had been seen having dinner with Diane twice, publicly, at a restaurant on Merriman Avenue that they both should have known was favored by attorneys. He was projecting confidence, Beverly thought. It was, she said, the behavior of someone who was less confident than they wanted to appear. He expected you to panic, she said. He expected you to take the settlement or to make a mistake. You've done neither, and it's affecting their timeline. Good, I said. I meant it simply, without triumph. I was not enjoying the conflict. I want to be clear about that. A woman who enjoys the demolition of 40 years is a different creature than I am. But I was, quietly and with increasing certainty, not afraid. That was the thing Ron had never understood about me in all those years of looking past me at the dinner table. Stillness is not weakness. Quiet is not surrender. I had simply been waiting for a question worth answering. They came on a Saturday afternoon in late May, and they came together, which told me everything about the nature of the visit before either of them had spoken a word. Ron rang the doorbell of a house where he had lived for 41 years, which was, in itself, a statement. Diane stood half a step behind him, wearing a pale blue cardigan that I suspected had been chosen to project harmlessness. I opened the door and looked at them both, and I felt the same quiet bedrock I had felt for weeks now, steady and cool beneath everything else. "Margaret," Ron said. His voice was carefully arranged, conciliatory, warm in a way that had clearly been practiced. "I'd like to talk. Just talk. Can we come in?" Beverly had advised me, more than once, not to meet with Ron outside of formal legal channels without notifying her first. I had her number ready on my phone. I looked at them both for a moment. This man I had married in 1983. This woman who believed she was inheriting something worth having. And I made a calculated decision. 5 minutes, I said, in the kitchen. I did not offer them coffee. Ron sat at the table where he had delivered his verdict 6 months earlier. Diane took the chair beside him and arranged herself with the careful positioning of someone who has decided that her presence here is supportive rather than aggressive. She had miscalculated. Her presence was neither. "Margaret," Ron began, leaning forward with an earnestness that had, I suspected, served him well in engineering meetings for 35 years. "I think we've both let this get out of hand. The attorneys, the filings, it's expensive, it's exhausting, and at our age—" He paused here on our age, a deliberate touch. "We should be thinking about peace, about family. We should be thinking about family," Diane echoed, as though she had been asked to speak. I said nothing. I have learned over 7 decades that silence is an extremely effective response to a prepared speech. Ron continued. He said that he was willing to revisit the settlement, that he recognized he had been, and here he chose the word with some effort, harsh in the way he had initially approached the situation, that he understood I had my business interests, and he wasn't trying to take those from me. All he wanted, he said, was fairness. He wanted us to walk away from 40 years with dignity, without courts and judges and the whole community knowing their private business. Then came the turn. It was smooth. I will give him that. He transitioned with a concerned frown that would have been convincing in another decade of our marriage. He said he had spoken to James, that James was worried about me, about the stress of litigation at my age, about my health, about whether I was really thinking clearly given everything I was going through. He said he would hate for the children to be drawn into a courtroom situation that reflected badly on both their parents. He said he had always thought, between the two of us, that I was the one who understood what mattered. Between the two of us, I was the one who understood what mattered. After 40 years of being told not to worry about things I didn't understand, I looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked at Diane, who was nodding along with the sincerity of a woman watching a performance she had helped rehearse. "Ron," I said, "what you're describing as fairness is a settlement that takes my house, reduces my support to a fraction of what the court is likely to award, and asks me to pay $250,000 in what your attorney has called a contribution adjustment. You've now added the suggestion that our children are concerned about my mental fitness, which I assume you believe will frighten me." I paused. "Is there anything else?" Ron's jaw tightened, just slightly, but I knew that jaw. Diane leaned forward. Her voice shifted. The harmless cardigan doing less work now. "Margaret, we're trying to help you. You're 73 years old. Do you really want to spend the next year of your life in litigation? Think about what that does to a person. Think about the stress, the exposure, the... She stopped herself, reconsidered, and arrived at a word she clearly felt was her strongest card. The humiliation of having your personal finances aired in public. I thought about 11,000 newsletter replies, about Carol and Evelyn and Susan's Sunday calls. Diane, I said, I've been a writer for 40 years. I'm not afraid of being read. The silence that followed had a particular texture. Ron's face moved through something, not quite anger yet, but the antechamber of it. He sat back. He looked at me the way I realized. He had been looking at me for the last decade, as a problem that had not resolved itself on schedule. You're making a mistake, he said. The warmth was entirely gone now. Perhaps, I said. I'll see you in court. I stood. They left. I closed the door and stood in my kitchen for a moment, listening to his car, the familiar sound of that engine. Pull out of the driveway for, I was fairly certain, the last time. Then I went to the window and sat down and called Beverly. He came to the house, I said. I know, she said. Your neighbor Evelyn texted me 20 minutes ago. She was on her porch. I started laughing. I surprised myself with it. A real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere uncomplicated. But later, after Beverly and I had spoken through the implications, the visit would be noted, the pressure tactics documented, the mention of James filed carefully away. I sat alone in the quiet house and allowed the fear a moment of honest acknowledgement. Because it was there. Of course it was. He had mentioned James. He had mentioned humiliation. He was a man who had spent 40 years inside a narrative of his own construction, and the men who live inside those narratives can be, when the narrative is threatened, genuinely frightening. I sat with the fear for a few minutes. I let it be real. Then I picked up my pen and I wrote tomorrow's newsletter section, and the fear became the fuel it was always going to be. And I worked until midnight, and my handwriting was perfectly steady. The final hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in September, 8 months after Ron had set down his fork at our kitchen table and told me who I was. Beverly had prepared for 6 weeks with the focused energy of someone who regards preparation as both professional duty and personal creed. We had met every Thursday afternoon at her office on Lexington Avenue, working through the documentation, anticipating Gerald Fitch's arguments, and, crucially, preparing the one piece of evidence that Beverly had been holding in reserve since I first mentioned it in our initial meeting. The birthday party video. Susan had retrieved it from a friend who had been filming when Ron made his remarks about Margaret, playing at writing. The friend, a woman named Louise, who had known me for 15 years and who I suspect had been waiting for an occasion to be useful, had kept the original file, date-stamped, unedited. Beverly had it authenticated by a digital forensics firm in Charlotte. In the recording, Ron was clearly visible, glass in hand, mid-anecdote, smiling at a circle of guests. She has her little writing projects. It keeps her busy. You know how it is. 14 seconds. Perfectly clear audio. It was not, Beverly explained, the central pillar of our case. It didn't need to be. It was the detail, the specific, human, visible detail that would make everything else coherent to Judge Dawson. It would show who Ronald Whitfield believed his wife to be, and it would show, by contrast, who she actually was. I dressed carefully that Tuesday morning, dark navy, which I have always found clarifying. I took the drive to the courthouse alone because Beverly and I had agreed that arriving together looked coordinated, and I wanted to arrive looking simply like myself, a 73-year-old woman with somewhere to be. Ron and Gerald were already inside when I arrived. Ron was wearing his gray suit, the one he wore to funerals and important occasions, and he was speaking to Gerald in a low, focused tone that stopped when I entered. He looked at me with an assessment that I recognized. He was trying, I think, to read my confidence level. He had been doing that for months. I sat down and opened my water bottle and reviewed my notes. Judge Dawson entered at 9:10. She had, I had noticed over our previous appearances, a particular quality of attention. She listened with her whole face, giving nothing away, which in my experience is the mark of someone who has already learned to distrust the performance of emotion and is waiting for something more reliable. Gerald Fitch opened with his reframing of the central argument, which he had refined considerably since April. He no longer alleged concealment. Beverly had shut that door completely. Instead, he argued for unjust enrichment, that Margaret Whitfield's business had flourished in the shelter of Ronald Whitfield's financial provision, that without the security of the marital household, Hale Creative LLC would not have grown to its current scale, and that equity demanded Ron receive compensation from that growth. It was, I admitted to myself, a more sophisticated argument than I had initially expected of Gerald Fitch. He had done his homework. Beverly let him finish. Then she rose, and she began with Patricia Owens. Patricia testified for 40 minutes. She was precise, thorough, and utterly unrattled by Gerald's cross-examination. She walked Judge Dawson through the financial timeline of Hale Creative with the patience of an expert who has explained complex things to non-experts before and has learned that clarity is the only argument that works. Every dollar earned, every dollar retained in separate accounts, every tax filing. The wall of documentation was not dramatic. It was simply immovable. Then Beverly played the video. 14 seconds. Ron at Susan's birthday party, glass in hand. She has her little writing projects. It keeps her busy. The courtroom was very quiet. Gerald objected on relevance grounds. Beverly explained efficiently that the video was directly relevant to the unjust enrichment argument. It demonstrated that Ronald Whitfield had never regarded his wife's professional work as a legitimate enterprise deserving of support, and therefore could not credibly claim retroactive credit for the enterprise's success as a marital contribution. Judge Dawson overruled the objection. She made a note. Then Beverly called Ron to the stand. I watched him walk to the witness box with the careful, controlled dignity of a man who knows he is in difficulty, but will not allow himself to show it publicly. Gerald had prepared him. I could see that in the deliberateness of his movements, the practiced calm. But preparation, I have found, only helps you as far as the questions you anticipated. Beverly asked about the business. Had he known, at any point in the marriage, that his wife operated a professional newsletter? Yes, he knew she wrote. Had he ever reviewed a tax filing from Hale Creative LLC? He hadn't been aware, he paused there, that there was an LLC. Had he ever asked his wife about her professional income? He had assumed, another pause, that it was minimal. Mr. Whitfield, Beverly said, her voice entirely without inflection. Over the last 4 years, your wife's documented income from Hale Creative LLC averaged $70,000 per month. Did you ever, at any point in those 4 years, inquire about her professional work? Ron looked at Gerald. Gerald was looking at his notepad. I wasn't aware of the scale, Ron said. That wasn't my question, Beverly said. Did you ever inquire? A silence that lasted approximately 4 seconds, which is a very long time in a courtroom. We had an understanding, Ron said finally. She managed her interests. I managed mine. An understanding, Beverly repeated. She let it stand there. So when you filed for divorce and characterized your wife as a, quote, penniless housewife with no income and no prospects, You did so without having inquired, in 4 years, about the nature or scale of her professional work. He stopped, started again. I had no reason to think. Thank you, Beverly said. No further questions. I did not look at him as he returned to his seat. I looked at Judge Dawson, who was writing something with the careful attention of a woman noting down exactly what she intended to remember. The lunch recess lasted 90 minutes. Beverly and I sat in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the courthouse, and she ate a sandwich and reviewed her notes and said almost nothing, which was how I knew she believed the morning had gone well. When we returned, Gerald made his closing argument. It was competent and it was not enough. Beverly's closing took 11 minutes. She ended with a single question, addressed to the court. Is it the position of this proceeding that a woman who spent 40 years building a legitimate business, paying her taxes, and contributing substantially to the life of this marriage deserves to be characterized as a burden? Or does the court recognize her for what she actually is, an accomplished professional who happened also to be a wife? Judge Dawson said she would deliver her ruling in 2 weeks. I drove home along the river through the September light, and I stopped at a gas station and bought a cup of terrible coffee and drank it standing in the parking lot because I needed a moment that was purely ordinary, purely mine, before I went back to the house on Sycamore Drive and whatever came next. Judge Dawson delivered her ruling on the second Tuesday of October. I wore the same navy dress. Beverly was beside me. The courtroom had the specific quality of a room in which something is about to be made official, and I could feel it. Judge Dawson read for 22 minutes. Hale Creative LLC was determined to be separate, non-marital property. The court found that the company had been built on Margaret Hale Whitfield's independent intellectual labor, with no material contribution from marital funds or from Ronald Whitfield's direct effort. The unjust enrichment argument was rejected. Gerald Fitch's contribution adjustment theory was rejected. The documentation was, Judge Dawson noted, thorough, consistent, and entirely credible. The marital estate was divided equitably. I received $320,000 from the sale of the Sycamore Drive property. I received 40% of Ron's 401k, approximately $152,000. I received spousal support of $3,400 per month for 10 years, adjusted for inflation. The court also noted in a passage Beverly later said was unusually direct for a judicial ruling that Ronald Whitfield's characterization of his wife as financially dependent was inconsistent with the evidence and reflects a fundamental misapprehension of the plaintiff's circumstances. A fundamental misapprehension. I thought about the dinner table. You're a 73-year-old housewife with no income and no prospects. Gerald filed a motion for reconsideration. It was denied. Ron appealed. The 3-judge panel denied the appeal the following June. No further appeal was filed. James drove to Asheville in November and sat at my kitchen table and asked me to explain everything. I showed him the newsletter, the tax filings, the birthday party video. He sat with it for a long time. Then he said, "Dad never once asked you about your work, did he?" "No," I said. "He never really asked me about mine either," he said finally. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. Susan was at the courthouse on the day of the ruling. She sat in the gallery behind me, and when Beverly finished summarizing the judgment, Susan reached forward and put her hand briefly on my shoulder. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. Daniel flew up from Atlanta with a bottle of champagne he had clearly bought at the airport. We drank it on the porch while the October evenings settled over the mountains, and he asked me questions about Hale Creative he had never thought to ask before. "Mom," he said when I finished, "you're kind of extraordinary." "I know," I said, and I smiled without apology. The house on Sycamore Drive sold within 3 weeks to a young family from Charlotte who had specifically asked whether the rose garden along the south fence was well established. It was. I had seen to that. Ron moved to an apartment in West Asheville. Diane Fulton had been considerably less enthusiastic about a man with a reduced financial settlement and a public court record. She had, by December, resumed attending the tennis club without him. The fundamental misapprehension, it turned out, had not been limited to me. I moved in January. The apartment was in the River Arts District. 2 bedrooms, south-facing windows, original brick walls in a converted warehouse building. Nothing like the Colonial on Sycamore Drive. Mine, in a way, the Colonial had never been, because I had chosen it for no reason except that it was exactly what I wanted. I had a writing desk in the window overlooking the river. I planted a container rose garden on the fire escape landing in March. 1 red, 1 cream, 1 coral pink. They bloomed by June. Hale Creative continued with its own momentum. My newsletter reached 240,000 subscribers that spring. The writing course sold out in 11 hours. A publisher in New York offered a contract for a 3rd book, and I chose the subject matter myself, a memoir. The honest kind. Not the retrospective that resolves everything into tidy lessons, but the kind that says, I spent 40 years being quietly invisible, and then I wasn't. And here is what that looked like from the inside. I called it The Inventory. It sold in its first month, better than my first 2 books combined. Carol and I still have lunch on the 3rd Thursday of every month. We laugh a great deal. Evelyn moved 2 streets from my apartment the following autumn, which she called a coincidence and which I consider a gift. As for Ron, life arranged things with the quiet directness of reality. He was living on his pension and reduced assets, alone in his West Asheville apartment. The story he had told himself about his own life had turned out to be incomplete, and incomplete stories reveal their gaps when there is nothing left to fill them. Diane was attending a tennis club in Hendersonville, last Carol heard. She had been seen at a charity gala with a retired dentist. Simply life continuing. And I sat on my fire escape landing on a June evening, with the coral pink rose beside me and the river catching the last of the light, and I felt the particular satisfaction of a thing completed. Not vindication. Vindication implies that someone else's judgment of you ever had jurisdiction over your life. I felt instead like myself, entirely and without apology. So that is the story, all of it. You are reading this, and I am asking you honestly, what would you have done? Would you have taken the settlement? Would you have believed at 73 that it was too late to fight? If you recognize yourself somewhere in this story, remember, the inventory is never finished. There is always more than you have been told you have. If this found you at the right moment, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe, because I am not done writing. Thank you for listening.